So I was told that the Veritas Forum is a place for people to try to connect some of their more fundamental thoughts about the meaning of life and our place in the universe to research questions they might be pursuing, or specifically a question about imagination and its relationship to being human. So I'll say a few things about that just to introduce where I'm coming from with this. So I've worked on the question of imagination for a pretty long time now. I think of imagination most generally as the ability to think about possibilities, to consider ways the world isn't, but could be. A way that allows us as human beings, as organisms, to sort of break free of the cycle of cause and effect, of being sort of immediately caused by something in the environment to do something else, or the immediate, always just to immediately pursue our desires, to instead step back cognitively, think about different alternatives, and then potentially act on those alternatives to bring new things into being. And I think one way I try to highlight the centrality and the importance of imagination is to say that if I was to awaken someday, having lost my imagination, it wouldn't really be me who woke up, because having an imagination is too central to the essence of what I am. It's not something like vision, which I could potentially lose, or the ability to walk, which I could potentially lose, and still be the same person. I think if I really didn't have imagination at all, it wouldn't be me. I do think it is really important then to what it is to be a human. To connect all of this about imagination to my more general beliefs about sort of the way the universe is structured. I'm an atheist and a humanist, which means I believe there's not an intelligent designer behind our existence. But I also think that humans are capable of doing great good for each other and for capable of leading meaningful lives. And tying those views to imagination, I think it's sort of one of the greatest feats of imagination that we have arrived at sort of collaboratively, the scientific understanding we have of our origins, however incomplete it may still be. That there's nothing, once you really sort of meditate on that sort of naturalistic scientific story about our origins, there's really nothing more, awe-inspiring or incredible to me than this idea that there was a physical universe, matter moving around in various ways, and somehow some of it eventually gained consciousness, became aware not just of the environment and things around it, but that it itself existed in this world, and then both developed the means for how we might come to understand what we're doing here, how we got to be here, and that we've already made so much progress in understanding how this all came to be. And so when I meditate on that, I feel a real sense of awe about that, and that it's easy, I think, sometimes to lose track of. I guess, my hesitation in terms of pursuing a more theological approach is partly grounded in the thought that it's really one of our highest goods and most significant accomplishments that we've arrived at this conception of how we came to be and how the universe works and how the universe itself came to exist, without relying on an idea of an intelligent designer, and that it would be a kind of betrayal of that highest good that we have of our own imaginations to go with what might seem at first a more obvious alternative, that we came to be in roughly, the universe came to be in roughly the way that we came to be from our own parents. So I do kind of favor the story, the naturalistic story we get from science, as a kind of vindication and a celebration of our own, of our imagination and what it means to be human.
Yeah, thanks for sharing that, Peter. You wrote this book called Explaining Imagination, which I really enjoyed looking through a bit. I hope we get a chance to talk about the different types of imagination there are, because there's quite a few types, right? And then also a chance to talk about what might be actually uniquely human, because it seems like in some ways imagination can be shared by other animals, but in some ways there's some aspects of it that we really only observed in other humans, right?
Yeah, I would agree. Yeah.
In fact, I'd say that there's something very distinctive about many types of human imagination. I liked how you discussed fiction. Fiction isn't a lie. It's something, it's like an alternate world that we create and we enter and very actively participate in when we watch a movie or read a book. Even fan fiction is this very real sense of trying to kind of consider this very obviously false counterfactual world in a way to really make sense of it and make it real. And there's something valuable about that. You talk about the idea of fictional truths, and I think that actually makes sense too. So I think that is really something, those are questions I really think about a lot. I mean, I'm a biologist and I deal with how the human body works, and I study evolution and all these things. And one of those questions that comes up is, are we really different from other animals? And in a lot of ways, we're very, very continuous with other animals, but in some ways we're very different. And people point to language at times, but I do think that actually imagination might be one other way to look at it, if we can parse it out, maybe to talk about what is it that's strange about the human condition, right? I think as I think about that too, I think imagination is really useful for some of the really pressing realities that we face right now. One of the thoughts that kept on coming to my mind as I was really thinking about this was Martin Luther King and his "I Have a Dream" speech. It's a type of social imagination he had about how the world could look that wasn't actually realized, right? He looked at the world that he had, which, when you think about the boldness of that type of imagination, it's not like there was great evidence that a better world was possible. I mean, from a purely empirical point of view, maybe that was all that was possible, right? But there was something in that imagination of a better world that actually gave us hope to actually pursue something and actually kind of achieve something better. I think that's actually really powerful about how imagination can actually be how we construct better worlds too, and think about it. And I think when I think about our current moment, I think most people recognize, at least most students I deal with, most people younger than me realize that the world that we have right now is not the best world possible. So what would be a better world? I think we have to imagine that. And I think imagination is really important in how we map out and think about what could be a better way of interacting with one another. And the final thought I had is, one way I've been thinking through that is stuff that came out of my book. And I'm really intentional on how I use fiction in that book. My book is called The Genealogical Adam and Eve. You talked about kind of like this naturalistic view of how everything got to be the way it is. And you said that you found a lot of beauty in it. And I agree. I actually see a great deal of beauty in it too. There's this other account of origins, which I'm not sure how familiar with it, but I'm sure you've heard a little bit about it, this idea of human origins from Adam and Eve, right? And so what I was really wanting to see is, this has been a place there's been a lot of conflict for a really long time, but is this really, really necessary? And so I did a very philosopher sort of move. I considered like the possibility of a scenario that may or may not be true that shows how both things can be true at the same time, right? And so the invitation, what's that?
It's a very imaginative combination you have there. Yeah. Is it possible? People say it's not possible to combine these two, but you said they've overlooked this possibility for combining them. Yeah, sure.
So then maybe you still think one is false. So like a person who, so on one hand, I'm turning to the Christian who thinks evolution is false, right? And I'm saying, hey, you think evolution is false. Fine. I'm not going to argue about that, but kind of enter this science fiction world where evolution is true. And let's kind of work out that science fiction. In that world, how do we think about scripture? And is this a possible world where that could be the case?
I just want to butt in here and interject a question for you to discuss a bit that is springboarding off of something you said earlier. You said that the human species, there's some continuity with other species. And so I just want to pose the question, as both of you consider from your perspectives what it means to be human, what do you think, or should I say, is the human species supreme on this planet? We seem to be the only ones who have this ability to have these complex thoughts, this imagination that you're describing. So does that justify a sense of human supremacy? Does it justify a sense of ownership over the planet? If we could discuss that.
Oh, I don't like the term supremacy and ownership, but well, I guess, well, how do you answer that, Peter? I kind of gave my initial take on that.
Yeah, well, so right. So I would think on the one hand, we do have some exceptional abilities for imagination that I don't think that aren't shared with other animals and things. And one of them is the ability to connecting to what Josh was saying, the ability to hope. Hope requires imagination by framing a way things aren't now, but maybe they could be. But in any case, does this make us, so on one hand, it's a superior cognitive ability. Does it make us superior flat out to another species or thing? I would hesitate. I would say no, in the sense that a tree is better at being a tree than I am, and I would say that, having an imagination is part of being human. I'm being better at being a human than a tree is. And maybe I'm particularly taken with some of our human traits and abilities more so than I am with the trees, even though, photosynthesis is remarkable and so is in its own right. But, I don't know if I'm just sort of rooting for the home team when I say that, consciousness and imagination is more, if I were to say, is more significant than say photosynthesis. I might, hedge on that a little bit and just say that it is very significant and important, in its own right, whether or not we want to say it makes us flat out, gives us a different status. So it's a little more complicated. Let me let Josh answer. I have more to say about sort of that, the connections to that, and sort of the moral standing we have and the moral consideration we deserve as a function of having the ability to imagine. But let me let Josh talk for a minute on that if he wants to.
Yeah, so I was reacting a little bit to the supreme and the ownership components. Just because something is the best by some dimension doesn't mean that they're best by all dimensions. That kind of gets to some of the stuff that Peter was saying. And the ownership implies that we can do whatever we want with it. Maybe that's not what you meant. I think a better way to put it is that there is something very peculiar about humans. We're not we're very similar to other animals, but there's also something very peculiar about us. And I think that that's an objective statement. I think if aliens from another planet came here, they would be wondering about why humans were different too. They wouldn't be wondering why the oak tree is different from the cypress tree. They'd be wondering about, what's going on with humans for a whole host of reasons. I also do think that some of the things that make us different put entailments on us. So, for example, while I don't think because we have fully human minds, we own everything, I think that does certainly make us more responsible for what's around us. To use the Christian terminology, is like we're supposed to have a good dominion over the world. We're supposed to steward it. And I think that that's something you can make a very purely secular, secularist case for that too, that because we have consciousness, that by itself is what entails certain moral responsibilities as well.
Yeah, I would agree. This ability to step out, as I was talking about, to step out of the cycle of just, responding to a stimulus or going according to some sort of, instinctual program, is the thought that we don't have to do that we can in some sense consider other ways of doing things and then do them, is important to think about why we might have a moral duty to begin with. I think the ability to have imagination also creates new possibilities for suffering that you might not have if you lack it. So the ability to look far into the future and into the past, and to extend your concern, far beyond, or to other people, including family members, not just them, but other members of communities, seeing the similarities between yourselves and others and other functions, even other kinds of living beings, as we can do, creates all kinds of possibilities for suffering that you might not have if you were another kind of species as well.
Yeah, I agree with you. It's like a different. I think we're on a different awareness, I would say, of any other animal, and I think that other animals probably know a lot more than we give them credit, especially the great apes and those that are pretty similar to us. But I think everyone really has to concede that there is still a pretty large gap between us and them, even though like our genetics is so similar. I mean, we're basically, just genetically modified apes, really. you
Yeah.
know, there's still a gap in our ability to conceive of the world and each other. And I think that gap is not, it's not subjective. I think it's subjective, and it's pretty substantial too.
Well, it seems to reveal itself to me, really vividly in things like, scientific advances, political organization, and the arts, perhaps. Like, these are different, places where it's hard to see others, as you're totally correct. Like, as fundamentals are similar as may be to other animals, still, like, how far off they are from arriving at physics or Beethoven, or so that's so if I want to raise my sort of atheist perspective on this, that's my thought, is like, wow, that's really special about us, and wherever that leads is where we should go and what we should honor about us. So that's kind of the with a motivating factor. And so my, sometimes atheism is put forward as a view like, well, it's too bad, that the theological story doesn't seem to be true. That would have been really nice, but we can't really believe in it if we want to be reasonable. And I don't really, I'm not drawn to atheism from that perspective so much as I am from the other perspective of like, hey, this is a kind of way of celebrating what we are.
Yeah, I mean, I guess the part where I just wonder though, Peter, is like I get where you're coming from. I can kind of see where you're coming from. I just don't know how. I mean, I get it so much that I identify with it. I kind of agree with you. I see it the same way. I don't know how being a Christian really negates that, I guess.
Well, let me ask you a question about that, because I'm curious, because you have this interesting combination of like a real passion for science, but then also a real interest in seeing how it fits together with a religious conception. How do you think about, like the issue of like God's intentions in creating the sort of story of evolution? So this is probably in your book, or maybe you think about like, why would, and there could be different possibilities. What are some of the ones you might think there are? Like, why would God have put these clues out there in the world for us to sort of really through a painstaking and difficult, but process, discover and piece together, as opposed to just giving us the answers or putting it in the Bible and things. How do you think about that?
Well, there's a lot of questions there. I mean, like, why didn't he put it in the Bible? I mean, I think there's a lot of stuff that is in the Bible. I mean, we don't have the formula for the COVID vaccine in the Bible either, right? I think part of it isn't that I think part of it is that the Bible's telling us a story that's important, but it's not everything that's important. And I'm okay with that. That makes sense. It'd be really bizarre for God to have been kind of secretly leaving like scientific clues in an ancient document for us to figure out. Now, that doesn't really make much sense. So what could be more important than this? I mean, it has to do stuff that has to do with relationships. I mean, you're an academic, I'm a scientist, but still, I mean, I love science, to be clear. It's become my, my life, and I love it. But the same token, like, it kind of pales in comparison next to my children and my wife, right? Those relationships end up being far more important, right? And then if we really understand, scripture in that way, is it's not so much about God trying to tell us the nuts and bolts of how the world works, as important as that is, but more about how to come into a relationship with it. That makes a lot more sense to me. That was one aspect of it. The question also too is like, why would God have just, spent all this time and effort making, doing things by evolution when he could have just popped us into existence? Maybe like some young earth creationist asked me that. Well, I mean, maybe he could have, but I think it does say something about who he is, that is actually, once again, really rooted in like old ways of thinking about the Christian faith. I think one thing that we learn is that creation isn't actually for us. It was really, God did maybe more like an artist than an engineer. Like, I'm not really aligned with the ID movement. I mean, they tend to kind of, honestly, their picture of God just seems a little bit small for me. Okay. What I get when I see evolution is like this grandeur and beauty of that actually is like an artist kind of making variations on themes and seeing and giving an autonomy to creation So it creates things on its own and by itself at times, and just there's joy in it. And like we're kind of like, we actually are kind of like the afterthought. We're at the very end. We're kind of we're kind of to the side, because like God doesn't really need us.
Well, that's interesting. Yeah. So from your perspective, the creation is less about us. It's not it's not so much human centric. It's like there is this creation, we're part of the story, but the focus in creating everything wasn't to create something. Well, the whole thing about humans being in God's image. And
yeah, so there's this teaching that that God isn't contingent, right? This is like philosophers saying this. You might even know what this means better than I do. But creation is contingent. That God could have done it whatever the heck way he wanted to. It's not like, I mean, the only way we know, this is actually where even science arises, is this idea that creation is contingent. It doesn't like flow out of some necessary logical truths. It is rather could have been made however God wanted to. So we actually have to go study it to figure out what the heck it is. That's like one of the core, I mean, there's a couple core theological concepts that are, behind the scientific revolution. That's one of them. And so this idea of contingency of creation, which means that like, if we take that seriously, it means that God didn't actually have to create us. He didn't really need us. And when we kind of see like a universe that's this grand and large and a story of life that's that long, I mean, it just makes very clear that God didn't need to make us, though he did. No, I think on the atheistic point of view, I think that's one of the puzzles too, because like, yeah, okay, so you believe, and it might be true even, okay, that the human mind can be explained by an entirely naturalistic process, but you also have to agree that there's nothing intrinsic about the world that demands that it produce something like humans. I mean, the world could have gone and just not produced us.
I agree.
It's kind of something to be a bit stunned by. I mean, I think that we're not paying attention if we're not a bit stunned by the fact that we're here.
Yes. Oh, yeah. I agree. It is a stunning thing. Sometimes I get frustrated if people say like, so you think, there's no God and it's just this and that's it. I'm like, well, yes, but do you have any idea how incredible it is that we even came to exist, and that like this table, like everything is incredible. It's so unlikely that any of this would have happened, that and that we're here, and not just here, but we can realize that we're here and then reflect on here and try to figure some things out and try to structure a world where we do some good. Yes, that is part of it, and I fully agree about the absurd contingency of it. But I try to, I do see that as like, wow, well, we gotta, it's amazing, and it's incredible that we're able to make something of this. We should celebrate that, but it also comes with a lot of responsibility to not waste this opportunity.
So here, Peter, here's my question for you. Okay. So I've turned to like the young earth creationists, and I've asked them to kind of do something pretty crazy, kind of imagine that maybe you're correct, or like we're correct on quite a bit, right? And enter that science fiction world. And so here's a question, like, do you have the imagination to kind of reciprocate that to, and kind of wonder about the possibility about whether or not there could be more?
Sure. You mean to think like, okay, well, imagine that, the theological story, there is a God, and how would you really feel in that regard? Yeah. I am sure. I think about that. I mean, and I do, I weigh that, so I've said, that here's a question I posed to myself. If you could press a button right now, and either the biblical story is true or the story as science tells it is true, and it's up to you to pick which one is true, what button would you push? So I think I would push the science button. Okay, so I'm giving up on eternal life, possibly. Well, I've got some sort of unusual views we don't need to get into about a possibility of continuing your existence, even if you're a physical being, maybe not forever, but past your biological death, may be possible. But anyway,
Oh, that's interesting, but okay.
Yeah, but things to think about when I really start to imagine the theological story. I worry about certain things like what would it really be like to exist forever? Am I sure that that's something I even understand or am in a place to say that I would desire? I'm not sure. If I think carefully about that, like that would be a good thing for me. I think I want to live a complete human life, definitely, very much. I don't know that in order to do that, I need to live forever. And what about, the suffering that occurs and the terrible tragedies that occur? Would that sort of help to set those things right? Again, it's like, well, would it really make it better if okay, well, a God exists and it's part of that God's plan that these things happen? Would that really resolve it for me? I'm not sure that would also. So I do meditate on that and think about that at times, and then I'm not saying I couldn't be swayed at this time or the other, but I do think that if I had to press a button, I'm going to go with the story that, as I've put it, tries to celebrate human imagination.
Why not press both buttons? Like, it's not an either or.
Well, in my story, it is.
Okay, fair enough.
If I could press both, but that's the fair. What if there were a third button? The both button.
So you're kind of talking about like it's a trade-off. I either have this or I have this.
Yeah, but if you can't have both, you
can't have both. Like that's like a very hard situation. I mean, it's kind of a hard counterfactual for me to think about, because having gone through a lot of sense of conflict and kind of coming to seeing how they don't conflict, it's kind of hard to undo that. I think about it, I just don't see any conflict there.
Yeah. So let me push you, not push, but just rephrase the question.
Sure, you can push.
All right. The question you said it would be when I said like, why did God, place these clues, as it were, in the world? And maybe you kind of answered this, but you said, well, it would have been odd for him to put weird clues in the Bible about the evolution story. That's kind of odd. But my first thought about that was like, why isn't it similarly odd that he put those little clues in the world itself? Because that's also his sort of creation, and could have not put those little clues there. Could have.
But I think evolution's true though. So I think the clues are there because evolution. It's not.
Well, okay, they're not clues. Okay, yeah. So it goes back to your answer about why the story of evolution is true at all, and to it being part of this sort of.
There's one thing if I tell you a story, like if I tell you how I came to be in Southern California, born from 2 Indian immigrants, I didn't mention evolution at all. That's not the story I'm telling you. I'm telling you a different story, right? But now if we'll go look at genetics and all that, then I'm going to, because that's the story that genetics tells, that's the story that biology is telling. So I just wouldn't expect that every story I tell to be in every place I hear a story, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So it goes back to the question then, I guess, of why bother to create in a way that gives rise to this long history of evolution? And
I gave you one, as I think that
you did kind of speak to that about something about the
there's another way I've been thinking about it though too, is I think when I look at how the world is and kind of the type of the character of God I see in the Bible, I think one possibility is I think that maybe he actually wanted to create a world where it's possible to be a gratified atheist. Like he didn't want to create a world where where our only way to be in relationship with him was choosing between like this horrible incoherent world that made no sense versus like being in a relationship. He actually wanted to create a world where there's like some relative autonomy to people who actually didn't want to be in a relationship and go forward like that. There's a certain type of grace associated with it, like a common grace.
Okay.
So I don't get like look, there's different ways to conceive of the Christian God. I get that. And some of them I don't think are correct. Like there's this idea of him being like a highly controlling person who's trying to like force everyone to do something. But frankly, I just don't think that becomes very coherent with history or with what the Bible is saying in the end. Is I think what I see when I see Jesus as a person who's just profoundly good, who's making himself known and wants to be and declaring God wants to be in a relationship with us. but he doesn't force it. It's there for us if we want it, but he doesn't force it. And consistent with that, like, he's created a world that doesn't require his detailed intervention on every single second. He's created a world that we can make sense of it, without having to constantly refer back to his action and all that, because it's like a relative autonomy. It's like a type of common grace. So you can be a gratified atheist if you wanted to.
It's interesting. Yeah, I've never heard that perspective on God, sort of like the understanding parent who wants to give the teens the space to be themselves, kind of thing. Yeah, I get that. That seems consistent with the.
I'd like to interject here, if I may, and help us to turn a little bit of a corner. This has been great. I'm enjoying listening to this exchange. I'd like to propose a different topic to turn into for a few moments, and that's this notion of morality or obligation. It's come up a little bit already in your discussion, but from each of your perspectives, to what extent can we speak coherently about a human being having obligations to his fellow human? I'll leave it at that. It's a bit vague.
Well, I think you were kind of hitting on this before. I think one key aspect of the human mind is that we have this ability to consider counterfactuals, to kind of step out of kind of like that immediate causal loop, to kind of think about larger relationships. One way to, I think is pretty striking, is that we might be unique in being the only animals on Earth that have a concept of grandfathers. It seems that killer whales and elephants have a concept of grandmothers because they are in these long multi-generational maternal units, but grandfathers don't recognize their grandkids because they go away. And then almost every other animal, they'll recognize their parents, or they won't, but they won't recognize their grandparents, and the grandparents won't recognize their grandkids. But we have this ability not just to recognize our grandparents, but then to kind of start talking about great-grandparents, great-great-grandparents, and to think about our children, great-grandchildren, great-great-grandchildren, even before they come that long chain of ancestry, right? We're able to look at a world that has always been unjust and be upset about it and want a world that's just. We have, that's a bizarre thing too. The world has never been just, yet we rage against the injustice of the world, and we want a just world, even though we've never seen a just world. These are the sorts of things where we can also imagine ourselves in someone else's situation and see and empathize in a different sort of way. That I think that awareness, comes with entailments and responsibilities.
Yeah, well, I agree with a lot of those connections you're drawing there between, essentially between imagination and having those moral obligations. I think chatting briefly with Connor before, I think you kind of linked this question a little bit to, like, especially from like an atheistic perspective, in what sense do we have legitimate obligations? And just to speak to that a little bit, it's this funny thing about that is, my parents were not religious, so I was never raised with religion. But I always felt very strong moral obligations, right? From day one, of all different kinds, so then to someone to come how could there be, obligations if there's not a God? And then to me, it's like, well, what do you mean? How could there not be obligations? There's obviously obligations all over the place. So what do you mean? So I do think, someone could try to say, well, I'm going to give you the argument for why there can't be obligations if there's no God. In which case I'd say, well, that's going to be a tough argument to give. Certain people do sometimes try to give it, but they've got a real high bar to cross, given how obvious it seems to be that, if someone's in pain, great pain, and you could easily help them, or something incredibly unfair is happening to someone and you can easily reverse that we have prima facie, we have a really strong obligation to help. It's going to take a really powerful argument to show that that's just an illusion somehow. And I don't think it's an illusion. I think we do have these obligations. I think, as Josh was saying, a lot of the reason we have them traces to our cognitive abilities to not be caught in a cycle of cause and effect, to consider, things from other people's perspective, to put ourselves in someone else's shoes. How that doesn't mean it's always easy to know what the right thing is in any given case. It's often very difficult to determine that. And philosophers, like to debate and argue about what's the basis of right and wrong. Is it all about increasing happiness and decreasing unhappiness? Is it something about acting in accordance with rules that you could allow everyone else to act in accordance with? You can debate; those debates go on, but that can all go on while we all are accepting, until someone gives us really great reason to think otherwise, that there are these obligations in the world.
Yeah, I think I don't disagree with you. I think all of us know that there are moral obligations. At least I really hope that we all do, and I think most people do. I mean, unless they're kind of in a very antisocial sort of place. But I guess the question that comes up is how much of this is like a fundamental reality of what's good and what's not good versus just a contingent fact of how we happen to develop. I think that's where it comes down to, right? So we tend to think that altruism is good with maybe some qualifications, right? Is that just a contingency of how we arose? And so if we encountered Klingons one day that just had a completely different sense of right and wrong, that there isn't actually a fundamental right or wrong, it's just like that they're just have a different nature. So are we kind of falling for the naturalistic fallacy? I think that's where the issue comes from. And I think while we can all still kind of have these pro-social ideas of ethics and morality, there is still, I think, this puzzle and this question over it about, is that actually grounded in something more fundamental than just our nature? I mean, do you see that question there?
Yeah. I think, it is a difficult question, what makes something good or bad? So I always brush up a little against a little bit of philosophy of religion in my intro classes as a way of moving on to discussing different ethical theories, and a way to try to motivate people who are coming from a religious background to be interested in the question is of like, what's the basis of good and bad? Is to rehearse one of Plato's arguments in the Euthyphro. Are you familiar with this argument? So it goes something like this. Socrates is debating somebody who's a religious, about the question they're debating is this: certain acts are good acts to do, right? And then in the question he poses is, are those acts good because God commands you to do them, or does God command you to do them because those are the good things? So it's kind of, where's the dependency relationship? Was the act not good not good or bad until God commanded it, or was it already good and then that's why God commanded it? And then the way that at least Plato wants to push it is to say, look, no one wants to say that God just arbitrarily picks things to say, do this, and now that happens to be good. Part of like believing in the goodness of God is that God would only command you to do things that were good before he commanded them, right? And that he commands them because they're good. And so if you're willing to accept that much, then all parties need an account of what it is that makes things good. Why did God command those things? What is it about them that made them good enough to be the sort of things that a good God would command? So it's just to say that, yeah, I think it's a deep puzzle, but one that we have to confront, at least possibly have to confront, whether we are, religious or not.
Yeah, I agree with you. I mean, I think that in a way, one of the grand questions is, what does it mean to be human, right? So we're going to be sitting here talking for days if they let us. They won't, but we could, right? We're going to go out for dinner later. We'll probably be talking about that.
Yeah.
But there's this other grand question of like, what is the good, right? That's another one of those grand questions that we could do the same on. Maybe it's a sub question of the first one. I don't know, but that is like a big challenge to figure that out. I think though that even that telling is a little bit simplistic though, because if we do think that there is a God that's actually not just about good and evil, but actually being in a relationship with us, there can be things that are good because he says it. Like in the same way how my wife might ask me to bring her flowers for her birthday, I mean, flowers are not evil, they're not bad, but there's something that's particularly good about them because she asked for them, right? And in that relational context, there's something particularly good about a husband giving her wife flowers because she likes that type of flower and asks for it. That would not be true if she had not asked for it and asked me for chocolates, and I decided not to give her chocolates and give her flowers instead. That would actually be bad. And so I do think that there can be in a relationship where things that there's a goodness in things that arises out of being asked for them or asked to do them that extends beyond the intrinsic nature of those things. Does that make some sense?
Yeah, yeah, I see the example. Yeah, how far we could extend that. There's the questions. Like.
Well, I don't think it's a complete account. So I don't think it's true that murder is wrong merely because God asked us not to do it.
Doesn't matter how happy it would make your wife, if you knock me off, but I get it.
I'm not giving a complete account, just a counterexample, I guess.
Yeah, I like it. Yeah, I like it as a possible way of reframing the question. I see that, and I could see how there's this relationship, a special relationship out of which it's
but when it comes to these religious versus non-religious ways of thinking, I think the fundamental issue isn't actually, it's not going to be coherence primarily, because ultimately we don't think God we can fully understand, and even as an atheist you don't think you can understand all the universe, right? That can't be the primary thing. I think it really comes down to actually epistemology. How would we know one way or the other? I think that's actually the core question.
How would we know what in particular? Sorry.
How do we know whether or not there is a God, or whether or not natural world is all there is? I think those are the sorts of questions about how we would know. I mean, it's not so much the metaphysics of it or the coherence even, and that as a philosopher might push back. I would just say that we just don't know enough to judge coherence very well between these different things. That's the main reason why I think they're both sufficiently coherent that you can't judge on the remaining piece of incoherence just because there's just too much we don't understand. I think it really comes down to like epistemological question instead of like, how could we know?
Well, okay, so the main things that philosophers say in this regard is in terms of like moving from the question, well, we can't know for sure, to what reason do you have to actually actively doubt this approach, is the problem of evil, just the problem of apparent excess of undeserved suffering in the world, and this being at odds, and so with the idea that there's a good intention behind the creation of the world, and there are responses to this, appealing to the need for people to have free will and self-determination and so on. The where things seem to ground out and get a little difficult for me is, okay, I could see how there would need to be some suffering and some evil, but on the scale that we've seen historically, right? Isn't that a bit gratuitous? This shouldn't, shouldn't you have kind of come in and put the brakes a little bit, in the middle of the Holocaust?
Like, what are you talking about?
I'll interrupt here, because I want to bring it back around to what it means to be human. I think we need to bring you both on another day to talk about the problem of evil.
Okay, fair enough.
What a lovely thing to discuss. But I do want to change things up a bit to move into our last subject before we move on to the Q&R. And so for people who are tuning in and watching, if you have questions, be sure to send those in. We'll be starting some Q&R here shortly. But a third subject I'd love to hear you both comment on, Josh, maybe we can start with you with this, is in our day, technology just seems to be advancing at such a rapid rate, over the last few centuries and even the last few decades. What is technology doing, if anything, to the human experience? Are we sort of participating in the next stage of our own evolution, if you will? But what is technology doing to what it means to be human, or what might it do?
Also, technology has always been a part of what it means to be human in important ways. I mean, I'm like debating whether or not I would want to go into like a short review of history, but I'll restrain myself. But that's also one of the very distinctive things about being human, is that we we can actually adapt ourselves to any climate. We can build tools to accomplish anything that really animal has to just rely on their innate abilities and strength to do. That we build machines to do things, and it's been going on that way for a very, very long time. I mean, even just basic things like being able to make clothing is such a big deal in terms of how it impacts where our ancestors lived and how quickly we became a global species. But something is a little bit different about it right now. Like if we think about I'm a little bit past 40, so if we think about kind of my generation, we did not grow up with Hulu and Netflix. I mean, it was actually just a TV, right? And and then there was dial-up, so we're called the dial-up generation sometimes now, which is a lot better than something that's not quite Generation X, but whatever. And then now today we have like the internet on our phones, and the way how our kids are, my kid is like used to like watching movies on an iPad, and I think what's happened is there's definitely just a much higher increased rate of change on the technological side, and it's far more invasive in the sense that it actually sits like in our homes in a much more direct way, and in our day-to-day experience in a direct way, to the point where I think it's becoming harder and harder to imagine how people lived, 50 years ago. And I think that's just going to be increasingly so. And I think the changes are happening a lot faster than we have the ability right now to adapt to and understand. I mean, you can see that like a lot of social media debates about, is Facebook good or bad? And we all got kicked off of Facebook for a day, and was it a better day or not? Who knows? Because we were all on Twitter, then we were back to Facebook. So then is that like a really better type of humanity? Well, it's kind of hard to imagine going back at this point. And so I think we're at a point where like the world is really changing a lot, but we don't really necessarily yet have a way to adapt to it as a society quickly enough.
Yeah. So I agree. I agree with a little bit of that anxiety at the end, kind of wondering where are things heading. The rise of social media has, on one hand, it seems like it's facilitated quick development and change of certain social norms. Like if you think of how long before this, like the movement to sort of normalize and allow, legalize gay marriage and things like that sort of crept along through the 20th century and early 20th, and now very quickly changing norms around being transgender and gender norms. I think that happened like at a very fast rate. I think people who used to be in smaller, more marginalized communities can quickly come together and get a stronger voice and exert social influence. But so that could lead to great things in society, but we've also seen, how easy it is for people to dig in further into their own particular worlds and interests, and develop sort of and shield themselves off from the community that's right around them, and it's divided families and things in many cases where the kind of polarization that can be encouraged by social media. So there's those two things going on that are great and but also worrisome. And as far as like what it means to be human developing, this is interesting. I mean, I guess part of what it means to be human is what it means to be in a human society. And so as society changes, what it means to be human will change as well. There's also this more individual questions about augmenting our abilities with, say, artificial intelligence and things like that. I'm not sure where that's going to lead, honestly. I do think we'll see before too long, artificial intelligence that can rival anything humans can do, and maybe can be more imaginative than humans in a way. Maybe we would be seen more as using it as a tool to increase our imaginations. But there will be some difficult questions to face up to about what is it then that makes us special or especially deserving of moral consideration if we're creating things that have these similar capacities for imagination.
Well, I think one of the continual things that we have to work through too is how, and this has been a big topic in philosophy too, to what extent can and does particular technologies dehumanize us too, and really squelch, some of the more important parts of what it means to be human, right?
Yeah, right. So, somehow our humanity is not encouraged by everyone sort of sitting and looking down and scrolling through, and and so it does seem to be. So it's interesting. Like, what are these parts of humanity that are in threat?
Well, I'd say in the social media world, one of the core questions is, how do we deal with people across differences without demonizing them? I mean, like, I think like the trend in virtual communities where you can kind of do high degrees of selection for people you agree with, is you get a small group of people you really agree with that can very clearly and uncontroversially define their enemies that they're going to demonize.
Yeah.
And then when you do that, then it's I think it really dehumanizes not only the person you're demonizing, it also really dehumanizes you. I mean, I think the way society works is that we're in a common society, whether we like it or not. And frankly, we don't always like the people that we're stuck with. But part of what it means to serve the common good is to find ways to bridge across those differences, to find places of common ground where you can really serve people you even disagree with, to find ways how we could be better together. And if and when virtual communities subvert that, I think that's one of the ways how it dehumanizes us.
Yeah, well, it's very easy not to take full measure of the human being behind any particular statement or image or idea when they're just popping up on your phone as some caricature. And so there is an issue of how we're going to overcome or confront the sort of natural capacity of social media and things to divide people or pit them to be interested. As you said, the Facebook content that got the most clicks is sort of stuff that made people angry or upset, and so that's the stuff that is going to pit you against someone else, as opposed to revealing what everyone shares together, despite their differences. And this seems like it's going to be an ongoing tension and struggle, and how those are regulated and monitored. We've got the need for free speech and expression, and getting together in groups against pitted against this sort of corrosive polarization that's been going on. Everybody knows about it, and I don't think anyone yet has the key to dissolving it.
Hey, but hey, I think conversations like this are one of the bright spots too. So this is only possible because of the modern internet age too. Like, there's tons of people across the area kind of sitting and listening, even though we're in the middle of a pandemic, right? And we're two people who disagree with each other on important things, and there's still something valuable about. I mean, honestly, I enjoy the conversations most with the people I disagree with. That's where you find out the most interesting things, and where you might actually have things exposed to you and learn something, right?
Yeah, I think that's right. I think, and that's why, I was like, I should do this forum, even though it's not the kind of thing I normally do. It's not, I don't, normally, I go to lots of academic conferences, but there's usually people who are narrowly focused on my topics, and who probably have a similar many of them have a similar sort of overall metaphysical view of things. So it is important. It's like, no, it's important to do something different and talk to people you wouldn't ordinarily talk to, especially about important things like this. So,
well, we have two people who have written in, people you wouldn't ordinarily talk to.
Okay.
So I can turn to them. How's that for a segue? I'm not entirely sure who this one's directed to, so I'm just going to read it as I've received it, and then let either of you comment as you'd like. So the first question is, the world is clearly contingent and fine-tuned, in quotes, but one could simply reduce these two propositions to statistical odds. That is, we won a cosmic lottery. Would that not take out some of the mysticism and remove it from the non-random natural selection theory So I guess the idea is here, can't we just say that we won the cosmic lottery and be done with it?
I think that really misunderstands quite a bit. So first of all, I think that the fine-tuning argument, there's a lot of people who debate it back and forth, but the basic idea, just to lay it out, is that that there's several physical constants that have very high sensitivity. It means if you tweak them just a little bit, that you would get a universe that wasn't hospitable to life. And so the idea is that there had to be something that, and then maybe there's an intelligent designer that set that. And maybe that's true, I don't know. The other possibility is that maybe there's some underlying relationship between those that really constrains them to be those numbers. And so it's not really as lucky as you might take it. That's one possibility. The other possibility is that that this is the one set that we know about, but there's a whole bunch of other sets of constants that would actually produce a world with people like that. And then also people have looked at it from the point of view of like maybe there's actually many different trials of the universe, like in a multiverse, through cosmic inflation and things like that. So then it's just selection. It's like a weak anthropic principle on the fact that, I mean, we're here to observe these numbers, so therefore their numbers have to be consistent with our existence. Like, I think all that's true, but ultimately I think the issue is that we don't really have all the information to really judge odds on it. So I think it's more undefined than unlikely or likely. So I don't think it really solves that problem. I think a better way to think about it is this, is that there's probably 4 key things in our origins that, even if you can explain them from an entirely materialistic point of view, it still begs the question, because you can imagine like an alternate world. You can imagine an alternate world where these things weren't true. One is, why is there something rather than nothing? You can imagine a universe where there's nothing rather than something, yet that's a contingency in our world that we have something rather than nothing. Another thing is, why is there life instead of only non-life? I mean, it's very easy. I mean, frankly, everywhere we look with the telescope seems to be a place without life. So why is it that there's any life at all? There's nothing that demands that life be produced. So why is it that we see that? And the next one is consciousness. Why is it not just plant life and like, brain dead, tardigrades going around doing things? Why is it that we see consciousness? And finally, the human mind. Why do we have something like the human mind? Like, all 4 of those are pretty grand contingencies. You can sort of explain it by the weak anthropic principle, in the sense of saying, well, we're here to observe it, therefore we need a world that's consistent with them. But that still seems to really miss the profound surprise we should be feeling at that. I don't think it's possible to really judge odds on it. We don't have enough information to judge odds, but it should be very surprising. I mean, that's not something, this is the world that just didn't have to be this way. So now the philosopher can clean up what I said and make it more precise.
Yeah, no, I'm following along pretty well there. The fine-tuning argument, to me, you could, sometimes I wonder about that argument in the following way, just saying like, well, look, what you could say, it's really unlikely that humans existed, or is that the question? Or is it really unlikely that something extraordinary would happen? And those are different questions. I think there are many different ways the universe could have been extraordinary and amazing, where we didn't exist. So, or where there was no life. So now it may be hard to imagine what those things are for us, but of course our view of what it is for something to be really extraordinary and incredible is a little bit biased, right? We're like, it's something that includes us. But so yeah, on the one hand, yeah, I think, if you re-rolled the cosmic dice, suppose that even makes sense. Yeah, you might not get us, and it is, and you could think of it as us as humans winning a cosmic lottery of sorts. I don't think our unlikelihood, though, is an argument that there was design behind it. I think there are many other things that rolling the dice, the universe could have gone all kinds of amazing different ways, and this was one of them. It involves us. It had to go some way.
See, I think it's just the problem, though, because like, fine-tuning argument aside, why is it that we exist is still a fundamental question that I don't think we have a good answer for.
mean, why is there something rather than nothing, or
Why is it that we exist? Why is it that Peter Hassan, why does the human consciousness exist, right? I mean, we know that it does. Like we perceive it, we know it exists, but why does it exist? I don't think that there's a good account of that yet.
Of consciousness, of why consciousness exists, or why
the human mind exists. Like why do we exist? Like, we think therefore we are, but why do we even exist?
Okay. I could keep following up, or did you want to get to the other question, Connor?
I mean, I think this is kind of turning the fine-tuning argument on its head, right? So look, I'm actually granting that the weak anthropic principle does somewhat resolve fine-tuning to some extent, though I am content to let philosophers really debate this.
Just to make sure that we have time to get through a few of them. We've got another person who has written, and this is specifically for Peter. So Peter, a form of imagination previously mentioned was empathy. What might be the strongest atheistic explanation for the development of empathy, especially if acting on empathy would ultimately be very costly or self-sacrificial?
Well, that's a great question. So there are various explanations you can give, like, well, look, it's ultimately beneficial to us to help others and live in a society where we support each other. That increased our survival and so on, and compared to animals that didn't collaborate, and being able to have empathy for someone else, increases the likelihood that you will help them and collaborate with them. And so, and that's overall good for the survival of you and your community. So you can give an explanation like that I think makes a good amount of sense. I think the one thing to keep in mind, though, is that even if you accept sort of the picture we get from the theory of evolution and without a God involved, it doesn't mean that every trait we have was arrived at through sort of natural selection. A lot of what we have is kind of the result of random mutation, hopefully that didn't get in the way of our survival. So mutations that kind of really keep us from surviving are not going to get passed along that well. But other stuff comes along, and maybe one of those things might be a tendency to help other people, even when it doesn't help yourself, as long as it's not so strong that it leads to the death of your own death, or your failure to pass on your genes and so on. Then it'll continue along as part of what humans are, and potentially like a really great part of what they are. So you can accept it's just a general point about the traits of human beings. Yes, there's often an evolutionary story tracing to competition of the survival of the fittest for why it happened, but it doesn't mean that every single trait we have arose just for that reason. And so it's quite possible that empathy and some forms of altruism are just traits we happen to have, and good traits, even if they don't always improve our own survival.
We've got one final question for both of you. Are there certain ways of using imagination that might serve to make us better humans, whatever that might mean, individually or collectively?
Let Josh go with that first. Yeah.
Well, yeah, to kind of build off the empathy thing, I think that intentionally imagining, like the people, really trying to build empathy through imagination, I think is one of the most important ways we can really start to pursue this. To really think through the people you disagree with most, to understand their point of view and where they're coming from, and to really, for a moment, kind of leave aside the way you think about things to really understand where they're coming from. I think so much good comes from that. Jerry Coyne is an atheist biologist who doesn't like Christians very much. I've had a couple run-ins with him. But one of the interesting things about it is there was actually an article written about me that quoted someone else in a way that was a little bit negative about atheists. It wasn't a quote by me. It wasn't a quote by and I had nothing to do with it, but he was really upset about this. And I remember kind of like interacting with about it and asking, well, what is actually the problem here? And then I understood actually this point was going on. He's just very sensitive to how Christians demonize atheists. And frankly, as I've seen it, I actually agree with them. Christians shouldn't talk about atheists that way. I mean, they're people that are loved by God in the image of God. We don't talk about, we shouldn't talk about atheists the way we do. I mean, they're our neighbor too. And I remember just realizing that and realizing, oh, if I was an atheist, I would feel exactly how Jerry is. I might even react just as strongly negatively as he is. And that was important, I think, to actually take the time to sit down and understand and pause and see where he's coming from. And I guess the other place where I think imagining is really important is I think again about Martin Luther King and I Have a Dream. We have a broken world. And maybe this is the best world that we can see and we can empirically measure. Maybe not. But how are we going to get a better world? It's going to be when we realize it's broken and try and imagine something better. Like, what could be better than this? And to really think through that in like a deep way so that maybe we can actually start to build it.
Yeah, I agree with those thoughts. One interesting thing to note about empathy in particular, going back to that, I think Josh rightly noted, like the kind of empathy that imagination really enables is empathizing with someone who you weren't immediately already like, or you don't see yourself as like. That's the important, morally important kind of empathy. And because there have been lots of, psychological studies done on empathy and how it motivates moral behavior. And people are much likely to help someone if they're already told that, well, you two answered a personality questionnaire very similarly, or you have very similar likes in magazines and other things like that. And if they're told that, they are much more likely to help the person. And you say, well, okay, great, empathy motivates behavior, but you can also see it's extremely biased. And so when we're talking about the need for empathy, more broadly, we're interested in the kind of empathy that's like requires a real feat of imagination to get outside of your own sort of way of approaching things, to then see how someone else might see things and then empathize, which can be an uncomfortable thing to do. Like it's unpleasant. Like anytime you've been in an argument with someone close to you, right? You're sure they're wrong, until that moment when you're like, wait a minute, they're actually right. And what's happened in that switch? You're like, oh, kicking and screaming maybe, but you've kind of come around and you've allowed yourself to see things as they're seeing them. And that takes a real act of imagination that doesn't feel great at the first, but it brings about a lot of good. I agree, with the need for that and to encourage that ability. And I think it's very difficult to encourage that ability. One way to do it is not to say, you people don't know how to imaginatively empathize. So be more like us and start being imaginative with your empathy. But what? Now we're just back in where we were. So fostering that, it's a delicate thing, right? That's almost like a spirit, a teaching you would want from your your pastor, your spiritual advisor. How can I develop that ability to empathize beyond my own perspective? And someone needs to have a good capacity to inculcate that in someone else, which is a delicate thing.
Well, the way how Jesus talked about it is he said that, even the heathen, love their families, but you're supposed to love your enemies. So it's like a really simple statement, right?
Right.
This idea of like, it's not actually about, how loving are you to the people that are close to you? It's actually, how willing are you to love the people that you hate? That's the ones that you don't like. How willing are you to try to understand them? And that's a hard teaching. But I would also say that as we kind of enter into that, we do actually, in that type of imagination, I'd say we find something very real. We encounter something real about the best parts of what it means to be human, right?
Oh, I agree. Yeah, I think that's right. I think that's, it takes so much going beyond anything that feels immediate or easy or instinctual. Even there is a kind of push and and that we need to try to encourage that in our children, and make them feel partisan. And it's difficult these days to encourage that in a sort of a partisan, polarized atmosphere. But you have to think about that, very carefully, when talking to your kids about things, or current events and things like. It's very difficult to not already teach this is the one way to look at things, and to shut down a child's ability to empathize with someone who's quite different. But I think that's at least something that we need to keep in mind, in the forefront of our minds. Like when is it more appropriate to try to remain balanced in this increasingly polarized society?